Hello and a very warm welcome to the channel. Now, it's a festive season. It's a time between New Year and Christmas, so it's a time of happiness and goodwill to all men. So I wanted my videos to reflect that, and as a result, I'm going to do one on Stalin's purges, which is, it's an interesting choice. So we are going to react to Stalin's purges, not to the purges themselves. That would be really, really weird, and I don't even think the video footage exists, thank God. But no, this is not just going to be a video where you watch human rights abuses and just watch me being horrified all the time. We're going to react to a video from the Biographies channel, which I've done one of their videos before on Theodore Roosevelt. I think it's a really good channel. So it's called Joseph Stalin, the Red Terror, which obviously was Stalin's descent into madness to a certain extent. Although we can get into how much that was the case in the video. So thank you very much. Link to the original description in the video, and if you haven't already, please do subscribe.
20 million Soviet citizens died at his hands. For a quarter of a century, he ruled his huge empire with a ruthless iron fist. Terror was his modus operandi. While he was alive, no one, not even his closest family members, was safe.
Very true.
At his passing, he was mourned as the savior of his people. In this week's Biographics, we uncover the terrible truth about Joseph Stalin. A single death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic.
Scary? There's a lot of truth to that quote. I mean, I'm not endorsing Stalin, bad guy, but that quote has a certain resonance. Early life.
The man who would come to be known as Joseph Stalin was born in the small Georgian town of Gori. At the time, Georgia was part of the Imperial Russian Empire. His date of birth was December the 18th, 1878. Stalin's father, Vissarion Zukashvili, was also known as Beso. He was a shoemaker and also an alcoholic who spent much of his time away from home producing footwear for the Russian army. On his rare appearances at home, he would beat his wife and son. Stalin's mother, Ekaterina, also meted out punishment on the boy, but was generally protective of him. Stalin only learned to speak Russian when he was 9 years old, and throughout his entire life he never lost his strong Georgian accent.
This is a really interesting point. Quite a few of kind of major world leaders, particularly despotic leaders, either don't come from the country that they ended up ruling or kind of come from the fringe. So, for example, I'm thinking Napoleon was from Corsica rather than mainland France. Obviously, Hitler was from Austria rather than Germany. Stalin was from Russia. Stalin was from Georgia rather than Russia itself. So it's kind of interesting that some of these particularly despotic leaders started out very much on the fringe of the society they ended up terrorizing.
He was raised in an atmosphere of violence. Gori was a rough town, with organised street brawling being a popular pastime. On February the 13th, 1892, the young Stalin witnessed the public hanging of two criminals. The traumatised child came away with a hatred of the Tsarist regime.
Really? Stalin being offended by executions is just the craziest sort of twist in history you can imagine. I would like the level of mental hypocrisy of Stalin to go, the Tsarist regime is evil because it's hung two people, therefore I'll execute 5 million to make it even. Yeah, that's crazy.
He was sent to a church school where he excelled academically. He sang in the church choir and impressed his teachers with his intelligence and his memory. In 1894, he graduated 2 years ahead of schedule. Then, at the age of 15, he was awarded a scholarship to the Theology Seminary in Tiflis, the Georgian capital. However, the teen was more taken with the writings of Marx and Engels than the Bible. Declaring himself a Marxist and an atheist, he joined the...
Yeah, I can see it becomes a problem when you're at a theological college and you become an atheist. I'd love to hear sort of that there must be like an alternative history where Stalin just becomes a priest. In the same way that like Hitler becomes a sort of second-rate landscape painter, or Winston Churchill was killed at the cavalry charge at the Battle of Omdurman. Alternative histories are fascinating, and I think they show just how easily things could have changed.
The Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, or RSDLP.
Cobra emerges. That sounds like a bit.
In 1899, Stalin was expelled from the seminary as a result of his Marxist leanings. By now, he had adopted the revolutionary pseudonym Koba, which was the name of a Georgian Robin Hood-type figure. For the next 2 years, he worked as a clerk at the Tiflis Meteorological Observatory. During this time, he became involved in organizing strikes and writing articles for socialist newspapers. He also became skilled at making revolutionary speeches. In 1901, he relocated to the Georgian coastal town of Batumi. There, he was encouraged by the RSDLP to stir stir up unrest. He helped
As you
organize
do.
a strike in an oil refinery, which led to him being imprisoned. For this, he spent 18 months in jail and was then
Nasty.
deported to Siberia.
I mean, being deported to Siberia was almost a sort of rite of passage for Bolshevik leaders. I mean, it happened to Lenin, obviously it happened to Stalin. I mean, it shows you two things. First of all, the Tsarist regime was very oppressive. I mean, even by the standards of the time, it was very oppressive. But second of all, it's nothing like as oppressive as what was to come, because during the Stalinist era, political opponents were executed by the tens and hundreds of thousands. They weren't just sent to Siberia for a bit. I mean, lots of people were sent to Siberia, millions of people were, but they tended to be sort of second-tier opponents, not your primary enemies. So yeah, it shows both how oppressive and how comparatively mild compared to what was to come the Tsarist regime was.
Over the next 12 years, Stalin, he was arrested 6 times. Each time, he managed to escape and return to the West, often travelling on forged documents. He was arrested for the final time in February of 1913 and was exiled to Turkhansk, the most inhospitable part of Siberia. He was there
Sounds
for
nasty.
4 years.
Sounds cold.
These years, they hardened him and they made him cynical. In 1906, Stalin married his first wife, Kato Svanisi. Their son, Yakov, was born the following year. Stalin was often absent, busy inciting unrest. As a result, his wife and son saw little of him. Kato died of typhus in December of 1907 at the age of 22. At her funeral, Stalin declared, "This creature softened my heart of stone. She has died, and with her have died my last warm feelings for humanity."
Oh, that quote is chilling. I've died my last warm feelings for humanity. I'd love to know if there were other sources around at the time that say that, like, did Stalin's attitude change dramatically when his wife died? Because that is bone chilling, considering we know what is to come, and like, to what extent did his wife play, or the early death of his wife play a role in him becoming the tyrant he did?
Stalin ignored his son, who was brought up by his in-laws. In later years, Stalin ordered the arrest and execution of much of Kato's family, including her brother Alexander, who had introduced Stalin to Kato. In 1911, Stalin...
And this was the brother of the guy he loved. It's seriously, the guy is it's just crazy.
fathered a son by his landlady while living in a remote Georgian village. The boy, Konstantin, never had any contact with his father. In 1903, the RSDLP split into 2 factions, Bolshevik and Menshevik. Stalin was an admirer of the writings of the revolutionary Vladimir Lenin and aligned himself with the Bolshevik cause. His work to undermine the Mensheviks and his involvement in a number of burglaries to raise funds for the Bolsheviks brought him to Lenin's attention.
So it's worth saying, when he says burglaries, I mean, Stalin was involved in very serious armed bank robberies. And that to some extent set him apart from the other Bolshevik leaders. I mean, a lot of the Bolshevik leaders were surprisingly middle-class backgrounds. Lenin's father was a school teacher. Stalin was a guy who got things done. He's prepared to get his hands dirty, and that made him very useful to the Bolshevik leadership. I mean, he was a man of action, basically, which is definitely not true of a lot of the Bolshevik leaders, who preferred sort of sitting around in cafes in Switzerland and London, having theological debates and arguing about really quite silly things with each other. So yeah, this is probably the first point where Stalin starts to stand out. Man of steel, which is Stalin.
Lenin was impressed with Stalin, calling him the wonderful Georgian. In 1912, he appointed him to the Bolshevik Central Committee. It was at this time that Stalin dropped his Georgian alias Koba and took on the name Stalin, meaning man of steel. The outbreak of war in 1914 accelerated the collapse of Tsar Nicholas II's rule. Defeat on the Eastern Front and the large loss of areas of territory to Germany, along with food shortages and economic hardship, took its toll on Russia's fragile infrastructure. Protests and strikes grew in intensity over the next 3 years, and finally, on March 15, 1917, the Russian parliament, the Duma, forced a provisional government. Protests and strikes, they grew in intensity over the next 3 years. Finally, on March 15th, 1917, the Russian parliament, the Duma, formed a provisional government. That same day, Tsar Nicholas abdicated.
So this is all covered very well by the oversimplified Russian Revolution videos. There's 2 of them, but also by my reactions, which I'm sure are... possibly add something to them, possibly take something away. Who am I to say? But yeah, so go check those out if you're particularly interested in that.
The 104-year Romanov dynasty was at an end. A year later, Lenin ordered the murder of the entire Romanov family. The provisional government, the socialists, mainly the Mensheviks, now ran the country. The dual power was necessary as the government needed the support of the Soviets, who felt unprepared to take on full power. Stalin, he was still living in Siberian exile during the revolution. He returned to live in Petrograd, where he took over the editorship of the Bolshevik newspaper Pravda, which means truth. The Bolsheviks were a minority party, and Stalin decided to cooperate with the provisional government in order to bolster the party's popularity. When Lenin returned from European exile, he mocked the revolution and condemned the new government as imperialistic and no better than the old regime.
So there was this iconic moment when Lenin returned to Finland Station in Petrograd, and hundreds of Bolsheviks had turned out to greet him, to welcome him, and he was their leader. And at the time, the Bolsheviks, or at least some of them, were sort of working the provisional government, or just starting to. I mean, because the provisional government, it was a hell of a lot better than what came before from their point of view. It was dominated by, or had a lot of socialists in it, a lot of Marxists in it. So a lot of Bolsheviks saw it as better than, or far better than, the Tsarist regime, and that they were scared of counter-revolution. But Lenin just said absolutely not. Lenin gave a famous speech outside Finland Station saying, we want nothing to do with the provisional government. This is another bourgeois government. This is another imperialist government. It's still going to oppress the workers. We want nothing to do with this. And obviously for people like Stalin, who had kind of been cooperating with a little bit, this really pulled the rug out from under them.
He censored Stalin for his conciliatory attitude towards it. As a result, Stalin toughened his stance not only against the government, but against other socialist parties. In July of 1917, protests against the provisional government broke out. Leading Bolsheviks were arrested, but not Stalin, who was considered of little importance. Stalin hid.
And that's the key point. So, I mean, Stalin would later be sort of portrayed as almost this demigod in Soviet society, but his actual role during the revolution was very limited. If you had to pick the 10 Bolsheviks who played the biggest role in the October Revolution, Stalin wouldn't be on the list. And whereas later on they sort of had this myth that he was second only to Lenin, but it was just complete nonsense. I mean, Stalin's role was very minor.
Lenin and helped him disappear into Finland. In late October, Lenin returned to Petrograd and urged an immediate seizure of power. However, moderates within the party advised restraint. Stalin surprisingly sided with them. Lenin, however...
So that's the great irony. It's that not only was Stalin not a key figure during the October Revolution, he actually cautioned against it, and that put him on the same side as other Bolshevik thinkers like Zinoviev, Kamenev, who were arguing it wasn't yet time to do the revolution. And it was Lenin's single-mindedness that forced through the revolution. A lot of Bolsheviks were very queasy about it at the time. They didn't think they didn't think the moment had come, basically.
Pressed on. On October the 23rd, a meeting was held in which it was voted to undertake an armed uprising. 2 days later, the Bolsheviks' armed wing, led by Leon Trotsky, took control of Petrograd. The provisional government was overthrown. The Soviets had seized power. Lenin instituted the new government, the Council of People's Commissars. Stalin was appointed the People's Commissar of Nationalities. Across Russia, groups opposed to Lenin's new autocracy joined forces to remove the Bolshevik government. As the Russian Civil War broke out, Stalin was appointed a political commissar and put in charge of the defense of the city of Tsaritsyn. This is the city that would ultimately become Stalingrad. He frequently clashed with Trotsky, who had been appointed his military superior. He once imprisoned a group of Trotsky supporters on a leaky barge and left them to drown. The Bolsheviks at this point...
That's crazy. At the time, Trotsky was leading the Soviet war effort. First of all, it shows Stalin's sadism, that he was prepared to do something like that. But second of all, it shows his, disregard for the Bolshevik hierarchy, because, Trotsky was running the war effort. He didn't need sort of plucky Georgian drowning his supporters in barges. So yeah, you can see both Stalin's boldness and his sadism, to be honest, with incidents like that.
Point changed their name to the Russian Communist Party. Stalin's rise through this group's ranks was impressive, and he owed it all to the support of Lenin. In 1922, Lenin made him General Secretary of the Communist Party's Central Committee, a post he held for the rest of his life. But within a year, Stalin had fallen out with Lenin. Georgia, Stalin's home state, had been promised autonomy at the time of the revolution, but that promise had been reneged on. Between 1918 and 1921, it had enjoyed a period of self-rule, but in 1922, Lenin decided to bring it back into the fold.
So this was one of the big debates of the Bolsheviks once they took over. Obviously, there was there was a large number of oppressed minorities within the Russian Empire, many of which wanted their own countries. and some, like Finland, Ukraine, got them. There's always a question as to how far do you go? And I mean, Georgia was one of the questions. I mean, should Georgia be an independent state? Same with Azerbaijan, Armenia. And obviously, over time, the Soviet Union took more and more the kind of Tsarist imperialist stance towards these various different nationalities.
He wanted the reunion to be a peaceful one, but Stalin, he had other ideas. He cracked down hard, having the leaders of the Georgian rebellion executed. And Lenin, at this point, he was absolutely furious. But in late 1922, he suffered the first of a series of strokes, which severely impacted his ability to command.
So, I mean, just going back to Stalin's role as general secretary, Stalin's kind of rise to power. I mean, after the initial coming to attention through being a very capable kind of man of action, Stalin was a genius bureaucrat. That was his advantage over his opponents. I mean, he was very, very good at moving around in the shadows almost. I mean, there were plenty of Bolsheviks who were much flashier. Trotsky, Bukharin, Kamenev, Zinoviev, much better at making speeches, much better writers. But and partly for that reason, no one really suspected Stalin almost until it was too late. And Stalin sort of worked carefully in the background, putting his people in positions of power and removing anyone who would stand against him. And then when the moment came, the Bolshevik Party became more and more loyal to Stalin. And people like Trotsky were really caught pretty unawares until it was really quite late.
In a testament which was published in November, he castigated Stalin. Stalin is too rude. This defect becomes intolerable in a secretary general. That is why I suggest the comrades think of a way of removing Stalin from their post and appointing another man in his stead.
So after Lenin's death, Stalin went to huge efforts to successfully suppress. Because I mean, basically, Lenin did a sort of final will and testimony, which was pretty damning actually of most of the Bolshevik leaders, ironically, but it was particularly damning of Stalin, who'd had a big fallout with Lenin at the time. He'd even sworn at his wife over the phone. And when Stalin went to huge lengths to suppress this, and did manage to do so, because if that had got out, that would have been dynamite.
Months later, while Lenin was still hospitalized, Stalin phoned Lenin's wife, who he suspected of feeding her husband's dislike of him, and subjected her to an avalanche of abuse, referring to her in the conversation as a syphilitic whore. When Lenin...
First of all, that's a horrible insult. And second of all, I'm going to make a note of that, and next time just in case I ever need to use it in the future, because that's a better insult than I think I can come up with on the spot.
Found out about this, he was unsurprisingly outraged. Yeah. Many people actually believe the stress of the situation precipitated Lenin's death about 10 months later. After Lenin's death, Stalin took the lead in organizing the funeral, appearing as the chief pallbearer. It was at this point that he initiated the deification of Lenin, even renaming Petrograd as Leningrad. Stalin used this opportunity to reinvent himself as the bearer of Lenin's legacy. From now on, to doubt Stalin was to doubt Lenin.
Yeah, I mean, it sort of became Marxism.
Stalin's main rival was now Leon Trotsky and his followers, the leftist Trotskyites. In 1925, Stalin forced Trotsky to resign as People's Commissar for War. From now on, anyone who spoke out against the Secretary General were risking their very lives. When open opposition broke out in late 1927, its fomenters, including Trotsky, were expelled from the party. Trotsky, he was exiled to Kazakhstan. In 1990...
So it can't be overstated how many of the senior Bolsheviks who actually carried out the October Revolution would end up being executed by Stalin. So the left tendency, which also included Kamenev, Zinoviev, both of them were executed by Stalin. And both of them actually had confessed to crimes they hadn't committed in a deal for their lives, which then, once they confessed, Stalin's ignored that and executed them anyway. Stalin would later be killed in, I think, 1940 or 1941 in Mexico. He was assassinated with an ice pick. Bukharin was also executed. I mean, really, the most dangerous thing you could be in Russia during the sort of late 1920s and through the 1930s was a senior Bolshevik. I mean, like, they had a very short life expectancy.
Stalin married his second wife, Nadezhda. They had two children, Vasily, born in 1921, and Svetlana, born in 1926. On the evening of November...
I mean, it's said that Stalin's daughter was possibly one of the... other than perhaps his first wife, was possibly the only person he ever truly loved. And he did try to protect her, which he did not do with his son or his sons. And I mean, for example, he was one of the heads of his secret police was a guy called Beria, who was about as much of a monster as you can be. But amongst other things, he was a sexual predator. And Stalin didn't care about this. I mean, in general, it's probably a good thing. But Stalin was very, very careful to keep his daughter away from Beria, and made it very clear to Beria that if he laid a hand on his daughter, that would be it. So yeah, there's a protective father in there trying to get out. It's perhaps the kindest way of putting it.
November the 8th, 1932, the couple were hosting a party to celebrate the 15th anniversary of the October Revolution. They often argued, and this occasion it was no different. Nadezhda accused her husband of being inconsiderate towards her. He responded by humiliating her in front of their guests. He flicked cigarettes at her and addressed her as, "Hey, you." The following morning...
I'm starting to think this Stalin guy might be a bit of a dick. Like, I don't want to go too... I don't know if any lawyers are watching. I don't want to go too far out, but it's just the impression I'm getting is for this Stalin guy, not a very nice person.
Servants found Nadezhda dead of a gunshot wound to the head.
Nasty.
During the Russian Civil War...
So did she shoot herself, or was she shot by Stalin or on Stalin's orders? It's not really clear. I'll look that up afterwards, or perhaps we don't know. That was the mystery. But yeah, I mean, that's horrible.
Lenin had ordered the acquisition of the peasants' grain and livestock. 85% of the Soviet population, they lived off the land. He had also ordered the collectivization of farms. Peasants perceived as better off, the kulaks were to be destroyed, killed, or deported. These measures caused...
And it can't be overemphasized. Like, almost anything could get you denounced as a kulak. So the ideal was they were sort of wealthier peasants who were oppressing the rest of the peasantry. But honestly, I mean, owning a goat could get you called a kulak. Owning almost anything could get you called a kulak. I mean, the Bolsheviks who went around targeting the kulaks or targeting those they regarded as kulaks were often given quotas. They were told, find 10,000 kulaks and arrest them. And if they couldn't find 10,000 rich peasants, well, they would find other people to make up the numbers. It was really, really desperate, really, really arbitrary. And it also shows to some extent that the big flaw in Bolshevik ideology, which was that, in contrast to the Mensheviks, the Bolsheviks thought you could have a successful Marxist revolution, whilst the industrial proletariat, the working class, was still a very small minority of the country, and that was the Mensheviks always rejected that. So they carried out their revolution when the peasantry was still by far the biggest social group, and the peasantry was not their natural constituency. So there's always been an argument that part of the reason the Bolsheviks had to rely so much on terror was that their natural constituency of support, the industrial proletariat, was tiny when they carried out their revolution, and even small at the end of the Russian Civil War, where it's pretty much decimated. So I think it's an interesting argument.
Widespread devastation and eventually famine.
Collectivization.
Realizing his mistake, Lenin in 1921 introduced a new economic policy to try to improve the situation. However, in 1928, Stalin decided to reintroduce collectivization. He aimed to achieve this within 5 years. Anyone who was
So, I mean, Lenin's new economic policy was actually a really big concession for the Bolsheviks to make. It essentially allowed a reasonable amount of private enterprise to continue in the Soviet Union. And this was really unpopular with the Bolshevik grassroots. So, I mean, Stalin got major points from the Bolshevik grassroots by rejecting this and going back in 28 to a fully collectivized system. But I mean, as we're about to see, I'm sure that the consequences were pretty horrendous.
Resisted was simply put to death. In December of 1929, Stalin announced the liquidation of the kulaks as a class. Poorer peasants were encouraged to denounce the kulaks, who were to be shot on sight, or, if they were lucky, deported to gulags in Siberia. Stalin sent out armed forces into the countryside to force villagers into collectives. Many of the people had no knowledge of agriculture. The kulaks resorted to slaughtering their own cattle and destroying their own equipment rather than see it disappear into the hands of the state. Terrible famine then ensued. In Ukraine, it was the worst, with up to 10 million people dying.
So that the famine was awful across much of the Soviet Union. There's always been a debate as to whether, because it was particularly severe in Ukraine, there's always been a debate as to whether that was partly used as a political tool to try and sort of undermine Ukrainian national identity, national consciousness. I mean, I don't know enough to comment either way, but certainly some Ukrainian historians treat it as not just a crime of sort of incompetence or of class hatred, but also of an ethnic component as well.
This time was to be remembered as the killing of hunger, yet the state offered no help. In fact, anyone caught with so much as a handful of grain was liable to punishment by death. At the same time as his people were starving to death, Stalin exported millions of tons of vitally needed grain. In 1931, Stalin stated that the Soviet Union was 100 years behind other countries technologically. They had 10 years to catch up, or they would be crushed by the rest of the world. His 5-year plan saw the birth of new industrial cities. Within a decade, the Soviet Union had indeed surpassed all nations in terms of industrial development, with the exception of the United States. But ordinary Russians, they felt no benefit from Stalin's successes. Factory workers became fixated on meeting increasingly unrealistic targets. If they failed, they risked the harshest of punishments.
So that's the irony. I mean, any workers' organisation, any independent workers' organisation, independent from the state, in the Soviet Union under Stalin was absolutely, utterly crushed. I mean, far more ruthlessly than the Tsarist regime had done. I mean, despite their claims to obviously represent the workers. But it's hard to overstate how much of a role terror played in the 5-year plan and in Stalin's relative successes in that area. I mean, basically, if you were a factory boss and you missed the target, there was quite a good chance you'd be denounced as a wrecker, a sort of capitalist stooge, and executed. So there was huge pressure on everyone to meet these ridiculously unrealistic targets. Obviously, at every level of Soviet society, therefore, everyone was lying, and none of the official figures were actually real. But yeah, so it was an absolutely horrible thing to put any human being through.
35 million citizens were residing in Stalin's forced labor camps, the gulags. At the 1934 political congress, a threat to Stalin's absolute power emerged in the form of Leningrad party boss Sergei Kirov. Stalin reacted with a fierce purge of the party that saw 1,108, that's 56% of the Congress delegates arrested, and 1/3 of them executed.
So we're getting to the Great Terror. It cannot be overstated just how dangerous it was to be a leading Bolshevik under Stalin's control. It was almost the closer you were to him, the closer you were to danger. Even shortly before his death, he was planning another big purge of the few remaining old Bolsheviks, so people like Molotov. And they survived because Stalin died early. If they hadn't, Molotov would almost certainly have been executed.
On September 1st, 1934, Sergei Kirov was assassinated outside the party offices in Leningrad. The alleged assassin, his wife, and 85-year-old mother were quickly put to death, though many people believe that Stalin himself was behind this assassination. Stalin seized upon this assassination as the catalyst for the Great Terror. He brought in a new law which deprived the defendants...
This was sort of Stalin's Reichstag fire moment. So obviously with the Reichstag fire, there's always been some people who think it was deliberately started by the Nazis. I think it probably was a deliberate attack by one deranged communist. I think the evidence tends in that direction, but I'm open to the other argument as well. So with the assassination of Kirov, it probably was he was killed by another disgruntled Bolshevik, but there've always been people who suspected it was Stalin. But regardless of who killed him or why he was killed. Who ordered his killing, I should say. It was Stalin who utilised the death to launch, his worst purges yet.
Of any defence. A number of Moscow show trials were held, nearly all of them resulting in the death penalty. Over the next 3 years, up to 1939, Stalin's purges became increasingly severe. He did this very methodically, drawing up arrest quotas along with numbers to be shot in each district. Still, over-fulfillment of this was encouraged. People terrified of being denounced got in with their denunciations first before they too were denounced. This led to the gulags soon being overcrowded and new complexes had to be built by slave labour. No one, except for Stalin himself, could truly sleep in peace. Many of those in positions of power became terrified that they too would be next, with some of them committing suicide in order to escape their fate. The military...
a lot of those close to Stalin were pretty much driven half mad. You could never be sure that, however friendly Stalin seemed to be towards you, however much he seemed to be in his good books, you could never be sure that you weren't going to get a knock on at 2 a.m. from the secret police because Stalin had for some reason decided that you were a potentially part of the plot, or someone else had named you as part of the plot, and then you just disappear.
Were not immune to the purges either. At the same time that Hitler was taking over Austria, Stalin was ordering the execution of his most able military leaders. Those who survived then became paranoid of one another. During 1930...
So this would lead to terrible performance by the Soviet military during, first of all, during the Russia-Finnish War, and then initially during the German invasion. It really took the Red Army a couple of years to rebuild from Stalin's pretty crazy purges. I mean, even the most successful. So, I mean, Marshal Zhukov, who was the most successful Soviet general of the Second World War, he was quite lucky not to get executed after the Second World War. And the way he did it was he was always incredibly deferential to Stalin. He'd always say, "Oh, I did very little. It was all great comrade Stalin's doing." And if he showed anything less than total deference, Zhukov probably would have been arrested as well. So it's a pretty the closer you are to the heart of the Soviet state, the more in danger your life is, ironically.
As Hitler's military muscle flexing pushed Europe towards war, Stalin feared for the safety of his country. He looked to Great Britain as a potential ally, but Britain didn't appear to be doing much of anything at all. So when approached by Germany, Stalin didn't hesitate. He signed a non-aggression pact with Hitler. It declared simply that the Russian and German people would not take up arms against each other. This
is the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. I mean, there were also some secret components. So it was agreed, for example, that there would be some level of defence cooperation secretly between Germany and Russia. But I mean, this was a huge shock to the Western Europe, to France and Britain. Because obviously Nazism and communism are diametrically opposed ideologically, and suddenly they'd formed not quite an alliance, but definitely a temporary friendship. And it was just a huge shock to kind of the liberal democratic or to liberal Europe.
This took a great deal of pressure off Stalin.
Facing Hitler.
In the summer of 1940, Hitler's subjugation of Europe seemed unstoppable. In less than 2 weeks, his blitzkrieg panzer armies had rolled through Belgium, Holland, and France. And at this point, he began looking to the east. Stalin, however, couldn't believe that the Führer would go back on his word. But on June the 22nd, 1941, this is exactly what happened. Nazi troops crossed the Polish border and invaded the Soviet Union. The Soviet leader was caught totally off guard. Within a month, German troops were 100 miles from Leningrad. Smolensk fell on July the 16th, and by June the 26th, just 4 days after the attack had begun, 400,000 Soviet soldiers were trapped as the German pincers enclosed around Minsk, a key stronghold en route to Moscow. On June the 29th, reports reached Moscow that the city of Minsk had fallen. It was only a week since the German invasion had begun. At this rate, the Germans expected to be in Moscow within a month. It was at this point that Stalin seemed to finally grasp the enormity of the disaster. He raged at his generals, even reducing the stolid head of the army, Zhukov, to tears. But then Stalin crumbled. He groaned, "Everything's lost. I give up. Lenin founded our state, and we've screwed it up." Stalin was driven to his dodger on the...
He's got a knack for quotes, Stalin. I'll give him that. There was definitely some truth to that. And also the quote about one death being a tragedy and a million being a statistic, which is, I mean, it's an utterly brutal quote, but it really does kind of summarise how humans think about these things.
Outskirts of Moscow. There, he slumped in shock in his armchair. The next day, he didn't come into the Kremlin or respond to phone calls. In his absence, no one dared to make any decisions or sign any documents. Suddenly, there was a chilling vacuum at the heart of power. Historians are divided on Stalin's mindset during this time. Some believe that he was playing a dangerous game with his inner circle, watching and waiting to see who would try to seize the reins during this time of crisis. Others are of the opinion that he came close to a nervous breakdown.
I mean, that was exactly the sort of thing Stalin would do. He would sort of give tests of loyalty to his subordinates, and if any of them showed the slightest initiative in terms of replacing him or making orders without his consent, that was seen as a sign of treachery. So for the other Soviet leaders during this time, I mean, it's probably Stalin did have a genuine nervous breakdown. He probably wasn't playing a clever game. But regardless, the other Soviet leaders just couldn't be sure. And then they were so terrified because they didn't want to do anything while Stalin was incapacitated, because then he would regard that as treasonous. And it was just chaos, basically.
Down. What Stalin faced was not just military defeat, but the collapse of everything that he had worked for within Russia. Finally, on June the 30th, the Politburo drove out to Stalin's dacha. They found him still sitting in his armchair. He looked up at them, haggard and nervous, and he asked, "Why have you come?" He suspected a coup. But the Politburo did not want to overthrow Stalin. They wanted him to return to the Kremlin and take charge of the State Defense Committee, the Soviet War Cabinet. A relieved Stalin, perhaps at his most vulnerable ever, asked, "Can I lead the country to victory? There may be more deserving candidates." The reply, though, it came quickly. "There is none more worthy."
I mean, you would never say anything else to Stalin other than that. And if you were going to turn on Stalin, you had to actually turn on him and kill him. You couldn't clip his wings, because he took any limitation on his power at all as a sort of mortal threat and would react. So yeah, you've got to show deference.
Nodding, Stalin accepted his new role, and he began to regain his nerve. Kiev was overrun by September. Stalin's advisors had begged him to evacuate the doomed city. However, he refused, and more than 500,000 people were either killed or taken prisoner. Searching for a scapegoat, Stalin blamed the prisoners themselves. All prisoners of war, he declared, were traitors. Those who returned after the war were sent directly to labor camps. When his son by his first marriage, Yakov, was taken prisoner, the Nazis approached Stalin about trading him for some of their own. Stalin simply replied that he had no son by that name, Yakov.
Oh, that's cold. Oh. And this is the son to his first wife, who was one of the few people in the world he truly loved. Even though I think he had a brother executed, we found out earlier. No, that's so cold. And yeah, Soviet prisoners of war treated terribly when they would return to Russia.
Was shot and killed. By October, the Germans were perilously close to Moscow. The government moved 500 miles away, but Stalin, he decided to stay, attending a parade on Red Square on November the 7th. The tanks drove past him and onto the front lines, just 25 miles outside of the city. The Soviet troops fought valiantly, and the Russian winter began to cripple the German forces. In the end, the Nazis were unable to solidify their gains, and they were steadily beaten back. Stalin also wisely teamed up with the Allies. When Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt met at the Tehran Conference in 1943, Joseph Stalin was reintroduced to the West as kindly Uncle Joe. By 1945, the Soviets had won the war, but the cost it was.
I mean, it really should be emphasised that the bulk of the kind of footwork of defeating Nazi Germany was done by the Soviet Union. I mean, the United Kingdom and the United States played a significant role, and also they also helped to supply Russia or to supply the Soviet Union. But a strong majority of German troops who were killed during the Second World War were killed in combat with Soviet troops, and the Soviet Union suffered absolutely terribly, both in terms of destruction of its territory, sometimes sort of genocidal treatment of its civilian population by advancing German troops. I mean, something like 20 million Soviets were killed, which is far, far higher than the figures for, say, the UK or the US. So, I mean the Soviet Union, it was the Soviet Union fundamentally that stopped Nazi Germany. Although obviously other forces played a role as well.
Enormous. More than 25 million Soviets had died, 6 times as many as in Germany.
Number.
Stalin vowed that he would never let Russia be this vulnerable again. At the Yalta Conference in 1945, the Allies met to discuss the post-war world. Stalin made it clear that Eastern Europe was to remain under his control. Britain and the USA, however, were not happy with Stalin's actions in Eastern Europe. Winston Churchill famously declared that an iron curtain had descended across the continent, and with that, the Cold War began. Back home, Stalin was even more popular than before. Grateful Russians hoped that the great victory over Hitler would sweep clean the misery of the past. Unfortunately, however, the war had merely distracted, not changed Joseph Stalin. Even though the crowds adored him, he was convinced that everyone was out to get him. Thousands of returning soldiers were sent to labor camps. Many Jewish intellectuals and doctors were tried and killed. On Stalin's 70th birthday in 1949, images of the great leader were projected into the skies over Moscow. His all-seeing eye was omnipresent. But the ravages of old age were beginning to catch up with him. After a great feast on February the 28th, 1953, Joseph Stalin had a paralyzing stroke. Over the next few days, he slowly suffocated.
So the story of, I'm sorry, suffocated, I think he said. The story of Stalin's actual death is horrendous and bizarre. I mean, there are some people who outright think he was poisoned, or possibly by Beria, because Beria made some remarks later in life that sort of indicated he might have had something to do with it. But what's certainly true is that Stalin was not given proper medical attention, possibly because the other Soviet leaders were just terrified to do anything. Partly because he'd had a lot of the most sort of capable doctors executed, because he'd become convinced there was a doctor's plot against him earlier. So then I mean, if you watch the film The Death of Stalin, it kind of deals with this. I mean, it's a comedy, but it's also it tells a lot of truths. So yeah, it's a good summary. But so doctors weren't allowed near his body for several days. So you have to wonder if some around Stalin were working toward his death. I think it's probably fair to say.
To death. Joseph Stalin died on the morning of March the 5th, 1953. His funeral was an orgy of grief. Soviets simply couldn't imagine going on without their god and father, but go on they did. 3 years after Stalin's death, his eventual replacement, Nikita Khrushchev, gave an extraordinary speech at a closed session of the 20th Party Congress. He said that while Stalin had been a great leader, he had also committed terrible crimes against the Soviet people. The myth of the benevolent, protective comrade leader was finally revealed for what it actually was: a terrible lie. So I really hope you enjoyed that episode.
So, I mean, that was fascinating. I mean, it's an area I already know quite a bit. I sort of do two types of reaction videos. I do ones to periods I already know quite a bit about, and I do ones to periods I know almost nothing about. And the second one, you get the more extreme reactions, obviously. But I try and add a bit more for the first myself. But yeah, no, that was a very good summary of a truly terrible human being. And I hope that hasn't put you off what remains of the festive season. I hope you had a great time up until New Year, and then, of course, a very happy 2022. And I hope you continue to follow my channel and watch whatever videos come out in the future. So, yeah, enjoy the rest of the year.